Okay, we're done with this. We're done with CNN. We are moving on to Hasanin. Um, Osita Nwanevu is here. Nwanevu is here. He's in the chat. He is on the Discord. 1 second. I got to turn off my camera real quick and turn it on in here. Hello, 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 hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Yes. All right. Perfect. What's up, Osita? How you doing?
Been okay. A little tired, but
It's been a while. It's been a
it
while.
has been a long time. It was 2020, right? It's like sometime
Yeah.
during that election season. Yeah. Yeah, glad to be back.
How have you been?
I've been okay.
You've been
Okay.
okay? Just all right?
Who's doing great, really? I feel a little bit better today than I did this time yesterday, but just all right seems about right, yeah.
Yeah. All of your congressional picks are wrong. You know you're a big proponent for the Republican Party. You're a big
Mm-hmm.
advocate, and
Right.
yet all of your candidates lost. How do you feel about that? You feel
Uh
good?
I I feel terrific. I saw somebody actually just before I came on. You know how like after liberals or like Democrats lose elections, some people come out and say, well, the thing we have to do is get like 10,000 people or 20,000 people out of New York City and move them to like, I don't know, Ohio or something. There's, I think Robbie Starbuck, like one of these like weird conservative accounts, started saying this, but for like Republican losses. So he was saying that people should move out of uh, like New York City who are Republicans and move to like rural Pennsylvania
Oh,
so
it
they
was
can win
Benny
elections.
Johnson. I saw that
Is
as
that Benny
well.
Johnson? I forgot who it was, but yeah, I mean that's I think a pretty interesting sign of their mentality at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. Do you feel like there has been that already during COVID with like Republicans unironically moving to Florida?
Well, I think it happens because people get old all the time. I don't know about people moving for COVID. Probably some people, maybe out of New York City, who were just sort of hyped themselves out about seeing homeless people and got really scared and moved off to better pastures. But I don't know if that's been like a huge landscape shifting thing. I think that what happened in Florida yesterday is indicative of just sort of like a broader shift amongst, I think especially the Latino community in Miami-Dade and other places. That's been an ongoing like conservative pull over the last several years. It would be interesting if it were just people who were mad about COVID and wearing masks who all moved there. I know, yeah.
So what happened? Let's talk about it. All jokes aside,
No.
what happened yesterday? A lot of the polls said it's over. It's a wrap. Red wave is coming. The media was constantly beefing up this narrative that like, if you live in a Democratic-run city, like criminals are going to come and kill you, and it's going to happen any moment now. There was this crime panic that, in my opinion, closely resembles the '90s, the post Willie Horton era. There was also, instead of one Willie Horton, I think like the Republican Party nationally ran on the Willie Horton scaremongering across the board in every locality, no matter how little crime was happening in these suburbs, right?
Yeah.
Also, on top of that, I think the Satanic Panic style, like weird parent teachers association, Republicans have been gaining prominence, or at least I thought. But it turns out they were just loud, and they were not as big as a majority within the Republican Party as one would have thought. What do you think about everything?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to say, just to start out, um, that it is still extremely likely the Republicans end up taking the House. I haven't looked at the numbers in a little bit, but they only need to take 5 seats. I think that they are about 8 seats right now away in terms of the most competitive districts from taking the House. Democrats, I think, would need to win at least 20 something of those competitive districts to have a shot of keeping the chamber. So it is still likely that they're going to end up with control of at least one chamber of Congress, which is
Yeah.
bad and will lead to bad things. And I don't want to sort of ignore that. But it was an extremely good night for Democrats, even given that. I was one of the people, like everybody else, who was expecting this big wave, less because of anything that Democrats themselves were doing or because of Joe Biden, but just because that's how these midterms tend to work. I think in every midterm election since 46. The president's party has lost on average like 20 something seats. If your approval rating is below 50%, it's even more than that. That's not what happened here. If Republicans do take the majority, it's going to be by maybe even one seat, a couple of seats. So they really underperformed, and it's
And on top
important
of
to figure
that,
out
eight
why.
percent inflation. Like I think that it
Right.
is ridiculous given the circumstances in any normal year for the Democratic Party to perform the way that they did. As Chris Hayes also correctly pointed out, nobody is supposed to be doing well in a situation like this. Republican,
Yeah.
Democrat, doesn't matter.
Yeah. So, I think that part of the explanation is what you've just said. Like, I think the Republicans really invest themselves in a lot of cultural narratives. We're going to hit them on crime. We're going to hit them on transgender people. We're going to hit them on the defund the police, immigration, with this assumption that there was this kind of natural backlash that was going to happen in response to a lot of the progressive cultural changes that have happened over the last decade or so, in response to the Democrats moving to the left on some of those issues. And it didn't happen, just like it didn't happen in 2018, right? People forget that there was this version of that under Trump in that midterm, where they thought that Confederate monuments and trans bathrooms and migrant caravans, all of that stuff was supposed to help them win the midterms. It didn't. So I think that what we've seen in 3 elections now, 2018, 2020, and this election, what we've seen is Republicans consistently overestimate the extent to which the public is really angry about some of the same stuff the Republican base is angry about. I'm not going to say that cultural issues don't matter at all, or that there aren't important portions of the electorate that are sort of more culturally conservative that matter, that are being turned off by certain things. I think that's probably true. But the Republican press and really the mainstream press, places like The Atlantic, even the New York Times, these sort of centrist scolds who are always warning about the left and defund the police, all that stuff, they really missed the mark here in a way that I think is important and going to be crucial for Democrats to tease out.
Yeah. I think the media outrage manufacturing cycle is not as effective. I was thinking about this long and hard. Part of the things that I am, part of what I'm seeing, and I want to hear your perspective on this, is that like Republicans have to run on wedge issues. They have to run on culture war stuff. Otherwise, they would be losing electorally way more significantly, right? I think that they have to do that. Otherwise, what are they going to run on? Tort reform and what? Deregulation? Like, after a certain point, a lot of the base, you're not going to be able to activate as you're not going to be able to activate without the culture war stuff, gun control, and how Democrats want to take away your guns, abortion. And what I believe is that the Republicans have either succeeded too far and like are victims of their own success with respect to the wedge issues that we speak of. Abortion, it's done. Roe v. Wade eliminated, is a 30-year project. The Federalist Society finally did it. But with that, you took away the carrot and the stick that you could use to mobilize the white evangelical Protestants without actually, without actually giving it to them. Because if you were to give abortion away, if you were to finally succeed in that agenda, then all of a sudden the conversation is going to shift away from will they, won't they, to, oh my God, they did do this. And now look at all of the 12-year-olds and 14-year-old girls that are victims of rape in states like Ohio who can't get abortions. Look at all the women with ectopic pregnancies that can't get this medical process because doctors are afraid of being sued. And there are plenty of Republican women and plenty of Republicans in general that also want at least the freedom to be able to get an abortion. So I think they exhausted their own wedge issues to a degree where like now they have nothing else remaining other than like demon hunting shit and trans panic. Like, these are, gender sickos that are trying to trans your children and they're all groomer pedophiles. And that is not as catchy or as captivating for the suburban voters who do fall on civility politics quite frequently when making their political decisions. That's my assessment. You can tell me I'm completely wrong now.
I think you're right. I mean, I think it's still important to remember that when the Dobbs decision came down, when we got that leak, the story in the conservative press was, oh my God, there's been a leak at the Supreme Court. Like, they didn't want to actually address the fact that they had won this fight that had been waging for decades and decades and decades and overturned Roe v. Wade. The story that they wanted people to focus on was there's been some breach of propriety at the Supreme Court, and that's the important thing.
Yeah.
I think that's because they knew this was going to happen. Like, the more that they talked about the substance of what they'd accomplished and what they'd done, the more people are going to be scared and weirded out and afraid about their reproductive freedom. So, it matters that in Kansas, like a month or so, maybe 2 months after Dobbs, can't remember exactly how long, you saw voters in that very conservative state rejecting an anti-abortion measure. Now, last night in Kentucky, I think Montana, although I'm not sure that they finalized that result yet, but in Kentucky and Montana, voters basically rejecting other anti-abortion measures. It's not like the bulk of the American people are, like pro-choice activists who donate to Planned Parenthood or are really gung-ho about abortion. I think the numbers show over the last decade or so, maybe even more than that, that the number of Americans who are pro-life and pro-choice has been pretty stable.
Yeah.
But Americans really did not want to see Roe v. Wade overturned. Like that was the extreme position to them. That was the radical thing that somebody was pushing. There's a poll a couple of years ago that I think that showed that overturning Roe versus Wade was like more unpopular than cash reparations for African Americans. Right? This is a really radical thing the
Yeah.
Republicans pushed through, and I don't think they can be surprised that there have been electoral costs to that. And I think they knew that was coming. Otherwise, they would have been jumping around, dancing, parading around about Dobbs months and months ago, and they avoided doing that.
I just never will understand why they did this because abortion was already functionally banned in red states through, trap laws and through a sequence of, bureaucratic red tape. They had basically already done that. Texas was over leveraging and like trying to do this bounty system that was going to be undermining every constitutional amendment, basically, if they could implement it aggressively. Then you could have, the same bounty system in California for like gun owners, right? I just don't understand why Republicans over extended in the way that they did. It was shocking that they finally pulled the trigger on it when it happened. I really did not think that they would do it because it's done in also such a undemocratic way that there's no semblance of democracy in that process. That like there's no theoretical democracy in that process, that you are directly, as Chief Justice John Roberts was afraid of, undermining the integrity of the Constitution, which I don't give a shit about. I mean, or undermining the integrity of the Supreme Court of the United States, which I think is great. I mean, fuck the Supreme Court. It is insane. It is a relic of an institution. It's inherently undemocratic. It's ridiculous. It's silly. And this kind of shows how political it is, finally, for so many people. But it is still weird that they did that, and I cannot comprehend why they did it.
Yeah, I'm not really sure either. I mean, for a while under Trump, I was going to CPAC every year. And at CPAC, there's a section, there's the big convention hall, the top floor of the I forgot that hotel is in DC where they used to do it. And in the bottom floor, they have all of these booths out for different organizations of the conservative movement. So the NRA and, the Heritage Foundation, all of those kinds of groups. And every year that I went, I noticed that there are fewer and fewer pro-life booths in the bottom under Trump, because I think that the evangelical wing of the Republican Party was becoming more and more just a Trump kind of fan club. They weren't as interested in the old social issues. I think people gave up a lot of interest after Obergefell and the gay marriage victory. So I think that there was, amongst political Republicans and like strategists, I think that there was a sense that abortion was not the thing to push and move forward with. But in the conservative legal movement and amongst, dedicated activists, they kept pushing this to the point where it got to the Supreme Court. They didn't really care, I guess, about the strategic worries of the bulk of the Republican establishment on the issue. So yeah, I think if it were up to like Mitch McConnell, if he could have waved the magic wand, you wouldn't have had the decision at least go down in the way that it did when it did. And yeah, it's one of the many things I think that probably cost Republicans last night for sure.
Yeah. What do you think about the crime wave? I mean, what's going on? You walk outside, there's rapists, drug dealers, and murderers in the streets, roaming the streets everywhere, obviously, right? I mean, cars are on fire. Yeah. It's like Joker mode. Everyone's going Joker mode. And we love it because, we love the Democratic Party and we love crime. But aside from that, I mean, I know what the intentions of the media was to beef up this narrative, to package it alongside the lie that like defund the police was a real movement. And they were basically working as the PR mouthpiece for police benevolence associations and unions all around the country. Whenever they did this like crime wave narrative, it was certainly prescient. It was certainly something that people were paying attention to. It seems like in the exit polls, that was something that they brought up quite frequently, even though the statistics themselves disprove that narrative quite frequently, right? Crime is not like increasing in dramatic ways, with the exception of homicide. And those aren't happening in the white suburban neighborhoods where these people are worried about crime. So what do you think about the media's involvement in that? Maybe not the reasons as to why the media was involved, but like, what do you think about the power that the media held on to, especially local news, with respect to just changing people's attitudes towards crime, or making them hyper focus on crime?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's I think like 50-60% of what local news does, right? It's these crime stories. Even if you live in a nice suburban neighborhood, there might be a city just 20-30 minutes down from you where crime is worse. And, people constantly conjure up these fears of crime moving into the white, safer portions of whatever community we're talking about. Again, this is one of the things we saw in 2018. So I grew up in Northern Virginia, Prince William County, which has become like a
Sorry to
very
hear that.
bellwether. It's okay. I survived. But Prince William County, which has been one of these bellwether regions or areas in the country, it's sort of emblematic of how the suburbs have shifted in the last decade or so. In 2018, there are a lot of people who are running Republican races in Virginia who are making the argument that MS-13 was just going to come up from the border and like embed itself in these kinds of like really white communities. They pick like this isolated crime or this isolated homicide that happened kind of sort of nearby a safe community, and they'd say, well, this is emblematic of what's going to sweep the country in a couple of years. And local news is an integral part of making those narratives stick when they do stick. The problem for Republicans is that despite the fact that local news was all in on this, and to a large extent national media as well, it didn't stick. And if you remember, I'm not old enough to remember the 90s or the late 80s. I actually can kind of sort of see why people were so afraid that it would. Those attacks really did work. They worked to the point that the Democratic Party was willing to embrace a lot of carceral policy that destroyed a lot of people's lives in order to sort of win back
Yeah.
that narrative. This time around, I don't know that I really have a firm answer, but this time around, it definitely doesn't seem like those communities, these kinds of white suburban areas, college educated, are as taken with those kinds of arguments. And the only thing I can sort of point to is just over the last several years since Ferguson, since 2014, I think that just a lot of kind of like white moderates have gotten woke about certain things. They've gotten woke about the police a little bit. They've gotten a little bit more woke about racial discrimination. You're seeing a lot of, in this house signs in front of expensive homes that Black people could never afford. So there's been a kind of cultural shift that I don't think that we've taken fully seriously enough in communities where crime would have really made a difference 20-30 years ago. That's been a barrier to those kinds of arguments really working for Republicans in the way that they used to. But I'm not sure I have a complete answer as to why crime didn't really stick in the way that they expected. I think that, honestly, story of a lot of those cultural issues, in addition to people just sort of moving left over the last few years, I think that even people who were uncomfortable about crime or scared about crime were also uncomfortable with a guy trying to steal the election, right? They're also uncomfortable with Trump breaking the law. They're also uncomfortable with all of the norms that he is shredding.
Yeah.
And that I think outweighed some of the things that Republicans were trying to do. And yeah, I don't know that there's any other explanation I could really point to. Again, as you were saying, like the conditions for Democrats are really terrible. Historically, this should have been a really terrible election, but there were some countervailing forces that made the Republicans seem a lot worse than sticking with the Democrats for a lot of voters.
So I'm of the mindset that Trump is a unique candidate because his brazen attitude makes him seem authentic, even though he's not, obviously, but that he is almost like a once-in-a-lifetime kind of candidate, almost like an Obama for the Republican Party, for all the Republican values, able to draw on, the reverse of the Obama coalition and create like a Obama-style Republican coalition. Do you think that Ron DeSantis, because now we know what's happening. Donald Trump said, He's most likely going to announce that he's running. He waited till the aftermath of the midterms to take credit for it, or potentially to yell at the Republican Party and not take credit for it. He's already fired some shots at Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis is killing it in Florida. He is seen as the new leader of the Republican Party by Fox News, at least. There's a lot of internal conflict. National Party Republicans despise Donald Trump for his volatility. Two questions I have for you is, will anyone else be able to carry the Donald Trump torch? Do you think Ron DeSantis will fall short of that? And what do you think happens in the Ron DeSantis Donald Trump primary, inevitable primary?
I don't even know if it is inevitable. I mean, I think that anybody, as much as Republican donors and elites, I think, do really want choices and alternatives to Trump right now. I don't know that anybody is going to be able to capture the spirit of Donald Trump in a way that's going to make a huge portion of the Republican base shift away from him. I don't know what argument Ron DeSantis makes to somebody who watches Fox News all day about why they're better than Donald Trump. I think people were kind of thinking maybe COVID, so there was this period when Trump decided to kind of sort of promote vaccines and was sort of like kind of sort of deciding to take COVID seriously. And at the time I was sort of like, yeah, there are going to be some Republicans who are going to remember this and say, well, Trump was cucked by, Anthony Fauci, whatever. I don't know that people really remember or care about that. So if it's not that, then I'm not really sure what the argument DeSantis makes is going to be. I don't know that they're going to be. I just don't know. Like the polls that Trump was sort of bragging about yesterday, the day before yesterday, at his rally in Ohio, it was like 70% Trump, like 10% DeSantis, and things like that. And maybe Trump gets weaker, but I just don't see it. I don't see a real challenge at this stage.
There was a Republican primary poll coming out of Florida. If there was a Republican primary in Florida tomorrow, and that was one where Ron DeSantis was actually defeating Donald Trump, not by like a wide margin or anything, but that was the first time I've ever seen a poll say outright that Ron DeSantis could beat Donald Trump. I think Ron DeSantis is always going to be the second best Trump. He's never going to beat Trump. He's not him. He's just not Donald Trump. Donald Trump has a way to captivate audiences and to make people get angry about his battles, no matter how petty those battles might be. I mean, he's got, ex-coal miners in West Virginia freaking out about Graydon Carter. These people don't even know who the fuck Graydon Carter is, or how much of a sissy Graydon Carter is, but they're like, yeah, those are liberal elites that are undermining you, sir, Mr. President, sir, just like they're undermining all of us. They're looking down on all of us. He has a very unique way of, he's gotten so much charitability from these people, and he's been the vector for all their anger. He's been the facilitator of all their anger and like owning the libs and whatnot. But even then, I feel like the coalition that Trump was able to captivate, especially against Hillary Clinton, is not one that he's able to maintain now, because you're seeing that in the midterm elections. Sure, he wasn't on the ballot, and that will be dramatically different. But, the people that he advocated for, his picks, they're not destroying the competition, and that's pretty meaningful, because I do think that a lot of the suburban white people that would otherwise be like, yeah, I'm a fiscal conservative and I want to keep voting Republican, find themselves interested in voting for a party whose main advocates on the ground are carnival barkers and, people that wear this like ugly ass Trump merch, people that are like smelly and freaking out about demon pedophiles, people that are going to the Parent Teachers Association meetings and like, causing a fucking ruckus. Like, at a certain point, that's going to come across as icky to a lot of these moderate suburban housewives. And I think that's the point where we're at. They're like, yo, these pedo hunters and these demon hunters are kind of weird.
No, I think that's right. So I think that's why I think Ron DeSantis, and just about anybody else in the Republican Party really, has a much easier time winning a general election in 2024 than Donald Trump will. I think he does have all of that baggage. The issue is just the primary. Like the issue is just, can Ron DeSantis or somebody else appeal to some basis within the Republican Party itself and poll people who are Republicans or who are conservatives, who watch Fox News and Tucker Carlson, who like demon or pedo hunters, like who like all that stuff, can they pull those people away from Donald Trump to the point where they can actually win a primary? I'm not
Tucker
sure.
Carlson.
Tucker Carlson could.
He's
Tucker
the
Carlson
guy.
could.
I think he's the
I
guy.
think he really could. But one thing I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. I think that it's actually very substantively important that Donald Trump is funny. We joke about it, we post about it, but I think it actually matters in terms of like substantive politics that Donald Trump is a funny guy who people enjoy watching.
Yeah.
What we saw in 2016 when he first ran was that people who did not have that juice, people who were not as funny, people like Ted Cruz, for instance,
Oh God.
um,
Yeah.
started trying to compensate for that by moving to the right on certain issues, right? So Donald Trump comes out and says he wants to ban Muslims from entering the United States. There's a point during the primary where Ted Cruz says, actually, you know what? In addition to that, we're going to have police identify and patrol Muslim neighborhoods and sort of create like a registry or something. And that's my claim on that issue, right? Because he didn't have the charisma, he didn't have all of the things that were drawing people to Trump through. He thought that he could compensate for that by moving to the right. What I think we have to watch when it comes to DeSantis is whether that kind of pattern happens again. So if DeSantis really, really wants it, he's not as funny as Trump, he's not as charismatic as Trump, he's not as good of a speaker. What does he do and start saying in order to make the primary more competitive for him? That's something I think we have to be a little bit scared about, honestly. Um, because I think that the reason why DeSantis does better in general than Trump isn't necessarily because he's like more of a policy moderator, because people pay attention to the policy substance of what people like him say. It's because he appears outwardly more normal than Trump. He
Yeah.
appears less crazy. So he could start saying a lot of crazy shit, right, to win the primary and not have a lot of that stuff register to the general electorate if he actually makes it through. So I don't know. That's something I've been thinking about. Like there's an extent to which Trump's own charisma shapes the policy discourse in the Republican Party, and is going to influence whatever ends up happening in the primary in
Yeah.
24.
That's a really good take actually. It's not one that I'd consider because like you have to run to the right as far to the right as you possibly can to win these primaries at this point. Ron DeSantis is not a charismatic person at all. So he's just trying to do the carbon copy Donald Trump shit. But going back to the midterm elections, and I feel like I didn't do a good job asking you this question. What do you think actually happened? Why do you think the Democrats actually ended up underperforming? I mean, the Republicans ended up underperforming, and the red wave didn't come. And I also want to ask you about New York specifically and Florida as well. On top of that,
Yeah, I think it's a lot of what we've been talking about. Like, I think that Trump has really imposed a cost on the party. I think there are a lot of general election candidates who spend a lot of time talking about 2020 and the election fraud or whatever, Biden stealing the election, instead of talking about the economy. How are you going to make people's lives better? This or that concrete issue. And that's something that Trump did. Like he elevates these candidates in the primaries. People get hyped about them. They win, and they're not the kind of people who can actually win the general election. They're not the kind of moderate candidates who can contest really, these kind of in the middle swing districts and states. I think that's most of what happened. There might be some credit that people are giving Biden for some of his accomplishments to some extent. I don't know how much that's really happening, but I do think that most of it is Republicans ran a lot of people, especially in these Senate races. Although we'll see, if Herschel Walker kind of sleepwalks his way into the Senate, we'll see. But these Senate races, these gubernatorial races, Republicans just ran people who were bad. I think that's true of a lot of these House races. And even if they didn't, there's this kind of general aura of instability and ickiness that the Republican Party now has because they're tethered to Trump that I think a lot of candidates suffered from. And I think Democrats need to double down on that, actually. So Biden still does this thing. I only watched a little bit of his press conference maybe an hour ago, whenever it ended. Biden still does this thing where he says, I know that what's happening right now is not representative of the whole Republican Party. We're talking about the super, extra, mega, ultra, whatever Republicans, right? They're the bad guys. And once we get rid of them, then we'll have a Republican Party we can work with. I don't think that's how you beat the Republican Party as an institution. What you want to say instead is like, no, these people are
They're
all
crazy.
like
Yeah.
that. They're all crazy,
You
right?
don't want
I
to be a
think that,
part
that
of that.
yeah, you don't want to be part of that. You don't want to vote for that. You don't want that in your communities. Like you have to sort of cast aspersions on the whole thing. And to the extent that Democrats overperformed yesterday, I think it's partially because voters told themselves that story. And I think Democrats need to do more to really push that if they want to not just keep losses down, but if they want to actually make gains in the future, they're going to have to start telling a story about the Republican Party that will make it unacceptable to the broad middle of the electorate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. You don't want to be the guy who's standing outside of an abortion clinic. Nobody wants that. They're weird,
Right.
they're smelly, their hair is scraggly, they're fucking crazy. Like nobody wants to be associated with
You
that.
don't
I
want to be
think we're
talking about bathrooms. You don't want to be talking about
Yeah.
blood sucking demon pedophile. Like you want to be you got to be normal.
Yeah.
On some level.
And
And I
the
think
irony, of course, is that traps Republicans, though, because like then you have what do you have if you don't have that? Republicans have a hard time because they've put their foot on the gas pedal and been so successful in the culture war shit. If they don't have that, what are they going to do? Run on policies like Ben Shapiro, like the shit that Ben Shapiro suggests? Like if they're not talking about gender panic, bathroom panic, all this shit, then they're going to run on deregulation and tax cuts. And I think that in that equation, you run into the Liz Truss phenomena. The difference between Liz Truss and Boris Johnson fundamentally is that Boris Johnson was able to captivate the media by being a buffoon and do like a bunch of racist stuff. Not so racist that it was like insane and unkempt in the eyes of like the majority of the population, because they had larger fears of anti-Semitism from the Corbyn side to worry about. Ridiculous, but that's a different story. But Liz Truss didn't have that as much, so everybody focused on her. Everybody focused on her methods and means of fixing the economy, which was just Reaganite, Thatcherite policy. Tax cuts for the wealthy, and that. And if that would happen to the Republican Party, that would also suck, especially because Republicans are now used to a degree of populism coming from Donald Trump. They're used to a lot of the people in the base, like when a Republican says, like, hey, we need to take care of our poor, that's something that they care about. They're not the rugged, industrious businessmen that they once fancied themselves as, maybe like they did in like the 80s or whatever. You know what I mean? Like the open disdain for the working poor doesn't work as well. So they're cooked if they turn around and just go back to those roots as well, because they can't win on policy alone.
No. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because I do think that there are going to be a lot of wealthy Republicans who are going to try to do the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute kind of stuff. I think we're going to be in the middle pretty soon of like an internal struggle of some kind within the Republican Party that I think Trump ultimately wins. But a lot of people are really kind of mad about what happened last night and are really worried. According to reports, a lot of texts and whatnot were flying around, and it might produce a primary challenge. But I think even beyond that, certainly at the state level, at the local level, when it comes to some of these congressional races in the future, I think you're going to be seeing more Republicans try to do the kind of the old, Mitt Romney Republicanism, the old John
Big
McCain
L.
Republicanism.
That'll be an L.
No, it's not going to work out for them.
No. And that's why I'm saying they're cooked. They're victims of their own success, in my opinion. I think they're too successful, or they were too successful in like pushing for some policy goals, all of which revolved around, of course, revolved around like culture war issues. No one is even talking about like how successful the tax cuts for the wealthy were. Obviously, I mean that's just par for the course. Both parties are going to do some form of that, and now they're cooked for that reason. Do you think the Democrats learned the right lessons from this, or do you think they think, oh man, the Pied Piper strategy was really successful? Look at all the people like Dan Cox or Mastriano and all these other people that we're like owning in these districts.
I mean, I think there's a danger that they learn the wrong lessons. So like a midterm election is very different from a presidential election and trying to win the White House, right? So the way that the Electoral College works um, it's a certain number of districts and a certain kind of districts that actually wins you that election. And those districts tend to be the ones as we saw in 2020, as we still saw we saw in 2016 and we saw in 2020, although to a lesser extent. Those are districts that tend to be more receptive to the Trump message. It wasn't we're going to put all 435 seats up for election again in suburbs and cities and all kinds of places. Like, there's a specific set of regions that Democrats need to really do well in order to have a chance of keeping the White House. Um, and those are going to be places where Trump is more popular. You can't rely on people being icked out by him to carry you then too. So if their takeaway from this is Trump is bad enough that we don't have to do anything anymore. We don't have to craft a different economic message or improve our economic message. We don't have to sort of tell people what we're going to do in the next.
Oh yeah.
When we get power again, we just have to talk about January 6th, and we just have to talk about Russia, and we just have to talk about Trump and norms. That's not going to be as successful as it was in 2018 and it was this time around, because the presidential year and the presidential election are just sort of fundamentally different. As a matter of fact, I think in 2020, Biden had to win the popular vote by at least 3 points. I want to say, don't quote me on any of this because I'm too tired. But Biden had to win the popular vote by a certain, over a certain margin in order to really win the electoral college. It's going to be, I think, even worse next time around.
Yeah.
So they really have to be not passive, but craft a really galvanizing message about, not just how bad Trump is, but what we can do as a country and where we ought to be as a country that's going to get people in these kinds of working class districts to really consider the party again.
Yeah, there are things that Biden could do to come across as more pro-labor. I think there was a ballot measure in Illinois that's or in Michigan that could help with that. There's methods that Biden could utilize, like the subsidies that he's offering to in the IRA. All these green companies like battery developers, shit like that. Illinois, yeah, thank you. Like all of these companies that are getting millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies, billions of dollars in subsidies from the federal government, you could literally make that subsidy conditional on the conditions that these aren't just jobs that you're getting, but these are also jobs that are you have to have labor unions. Like these are well-paying jobs that have labor unions. You could use the Hyundai example. Like Hyundai literally recently got caught for using child labor in Alabama, in their facilities in Alabama. There were 12-year-olds working in not one, but two different Hyundai factories in the United States of America, using that as an example, propping that up and being like, this is happening in the wealthiest nation on earth, and like bullying automobile manufacturers into and battery producers into using union labor. You could absolutely make a stronger pro-labor message out of that. And then, that kind of thing would probably work well in places like Ohio as well. Maybe, I don't know.
I think that's right. And, so this is something that I've been working on, actually. So I haven't been writing as much because I'm working on a book about democracy. I think one of the main arguments that I make in that book is if you want to talk about democracy and you really want to make it stick for people, that doesn't just mean talking about, the right to vote or talking about the security of elections. Or even talking about things like abolishing the electoral college. That's stuff that I support. If you really care about democracy, you should also be talking about economic democracy, right? So the rights that we ought to be entitled to at work, where we take it for granted that it's okay that we live and work under authoritarian governance structures and you don't have rights at work and the people can just sort of tell you what to do and restrict your breaks and tell you can't use the bathroom. Like if you want to talk about democracy, talk about unions, talk about empowering people at that level. There's a way you can fuse both sides of the message together, I think, in really compelling and new ways that people haven't necessarily heard from Democrats before. I think that's the answer. If you want to keep a narrative about democracy going and you want to win the next election, you want to speak to these people in these sort of post-industrial communities or who workers who are sort of being lorded over by Amazon. Like the way you talk about democracy to them is say, look, like if ordinary people deserve agency, they deserve it not just at the ballot box, but they deserve it at their workplace. They need to have the right to come together with their fellow workers, to demand certain things, to make sure that they're being treated in a certain way. So that's, if I were, head of the DNC, if I were Joe Biden, whoever, that's what I would try. That's the kind of message I would try to put out there.
See, in the words of DJ Academics, who once said these words to me, you're kind of teetering on borderline socialism there. I don't know if you're aware.
It's democracy, man. It's democracy. Call it whatever you want. I call it democracy, and I think voters like democracy, as we saw.
No, I agree, and I do think that is a very effective way of communicating that. As Richard Wolff used to before he started talking about COVID and whatever the fuck he's talking about lately. Yeah, that is, you're absolutely correct about that. Messaging wise, you're absolutely correct on that as well. Am I confident that the Democrats are going to learn that lesson? Absolutely not. Spanberger still won, even though that territory was up. It was a contested one. She keeps duking it out. Maggie Hasan won in New Hampshire. There was even no contest there. I don't even understand why people were making it seem like there was these were contested seats. Like, I don't know how the fuck pollsters, who they asked. Like, do they just only go to like Republicans? Like, I mean,
I think that literally in the last weeks of the campaign, I think literally aggregators like 538 were ingesting a lot of polls that were like, I think I saw like there's a poll that like 2 high schoolers did at some school that ended up in the 538 average or something like that. So there was a lot of weird Republican stuff that was being inserted that people are gonna have to go back and look at and investigate now. But yeah, I think that there was a real miss. Nate Bronze, Nate Tin.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that you can't just go off of the polls sometimes, or you can't sort of you can't look at politics in that way exclusively. When I try to figure out what's going to happen or try to make sense of what happened, I look at history. To the extent that I look at numbers, I look at like actual results from past elections and like economic conditions and demographics. But this thing that we do every election cycle where it's, the polls are up one week, they're down the next week, and we sort of write narratives and make arguments about it, I think is largely a waste of time. I think that there are incentives to make things feel more dynamic than they often are for pollsters and journalists alike. You want to keep people watching or clicking or reading. So you have to have things to point to get people sort of engaged and that make them believe that new things are happening. And I think polling serves that function, even though the polling is often, not a great indicator of what's really going on. So I don't know. That's a rant about political journalism in general.
Do you think that Gen Z was a factor here? Do you think that like younger voters actually came out in larger numbers? I've seen some conflicting data on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the good data about demographics in general usually only comes out like a month, maybe more after the election. People go off of exit polls a lot. I don't, because they're often it gets messy for like technical reasons.
Well, so, a lot of Zoomers in the chat want us to thank them. They can't shut the fuck up. They've been talking about how they did this.
Well, look, there's one guy in Florida, right? I think Maxwell Frost, who's going to be like the first Gen Z in Congress. Is that right? That's a win. So yeah, I think that people are aging up into power, and I think that's among the reasons why Republicans can't really rely on culture war stuff. That is really often about like how bad Gen Z people are and how dumb and crazy they are to win elections. Like those people, sooner or later are going to be a substantial portion of the electorate you have to pay attention to and respect if you want to get anything done. And they have more left-wing cultural views on a lot of issues. I don't think that's a permanent thing we should take for granted. People's views can shift and so on. But, the Republican Party right now is not a party that takes young people seriously. I wouldn't say the Democratic Party is, but the Republican Party, I think, is actively often saying that the problems with America are the cultural attitudes of young people.
Yeah. And no, they're tailoring their message to the 65 plus demographic, which of course is yielding decent results for them. But when young people do turn out to vote, all of a sudden, you're having a hard time. I think I'm a simple man. I'm not a very smart guy. So my analysis on this is always revolved around ease of access to vote, because young, old, doesn't matter. If it's much easier for you to just fucking write scribble on a ballot, and then just drop it into a drop box, you're going to take that opportunity to vote. Tens of thousands, if not millions more people are going to go out and vote that way. And I do think that, like, since COVID, those measures that were implemented and solidified in a lot of these states played a role in this, played a role in even increasing youth voter turnout as well. And that paired along with the student loan debt relief, I think, and also abortion, was the three main components that increased voter turnout, specifically in younger demographics, I think.
Yeah. So, I think whenever this issue comes up, why young voters do or don't vote, this is a perennial topic in political journalism. A lot of people end up saying, well, it's because young people don't really care about politics. They're disengaged. They play too many video games, that kind of thing. When people actually study this, when they actually survey young people or sort of ask them, why didn't you vote in the last election? It's often stuff like, look, like I left for college and so my address, changed, or I've like a different living situation, X or Y. Like young people are, who are old enough to vote are in a stage in their life where things are kind of unsettled and unstable. So they need to have really easy access to ballots. Otherwise, it's going to be more difficult than it ought to be. The other major reason that young people don't vote, or at least according to the numbers that I see, is because they sort of lack confidence. They say, well, I don't know enough about X or Y. I'm just, 20 whatever, and I don't know that I should have a say in this process. And that's a bad attitude to have, and it's an attitude
they're not stupid enough. They're not stupid enough to think they know yet.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, when Democrats or whoever talk about young people as though they're like entitled or spoiled or whatever, that only sort of reinforces that lack of confidence and ends up hurting the Democratic Party, the progressive movement, right? If you keep telling young people that, all you want is a pony from politics and you're not, you don't have an experience enough to really engage with political issues, all that does is depress and constrain, the ability, the desire of the young people that you need to actually change politics. It flattens out their enthusiasm, and they're not going to be there for you when you really need them. So access to the ballot, making voting as easy as possible, structurally, substantively, really, really crucial. But also, people need to stop shitting on young people and tell them that it's good to be engaged in politics. It's good to be involved in your community. It's good to take an interest in the issues. And you know what? If you don't feel like you know a lot about the issues, you bet you know a whole lot more than a guy who thinks that Hillary Clinton drinks the blood of young children at night. That should be you certainly know more about politics than Donald Trump, right? So
that's my goal, is to educate people to feel stupid and confident enough to go out and vote. You know what I mean?
You have the right. It's your democratic right to be involved. You don't have to know everything. All you need to have are certain values, a certain worldview about the way the world ought to work. And if that changes with experience, that's fine. But there's no point at which you earn agency as a democratic subject. You just have it. If we believe in democracy, that's just your entitlement, no matter how old you are. So yeah, get involved in politics. Don't let people tell you that you shouldn't be. That's really important.
Yeah. Okay, that was great. Is there anything else that you want to add on to that before I move on to my hogwatch proportion of this coverage, because I'm going to get back to consuming Republican tears.
Sure. Well, I don't really think there's anything else for me, but I really appreciate being back. It's been great.
Yeah, no, this was wonderful.
Always
Where can
happy to
people
be back.
find you, Osita? What have you been up to? What have you been working on?
So I have a newsletter that I do pretty regularly. I think you can post a link to it somewhere.
They
That's where
already are.
Yeah, that's where most of my writing is right now. I do some pieces for The Guardian. I'm still doing some pieces for The New Republic. Mostly I'm working on a book that'll be out in 2024, if you can wait that long. And it'll be about democracy and some of the stuff we were just talking about. What is democracy in the first place? Why is it good? Why we don't have it in this country, and what it would actually mean to bring American democracy about, I argue, for the first time. So that's what I'm working on for the most part, but you can still catch me some other places between now and then when that's done.
Yeah. And on the Hasanabi broadcast, which we'll be having you on again.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for coming on, man.